Welcome back to the exciting adventures of the nervous system. Yay! Whoa, yeah, so exciting! Electrical signals and neurons, an overview. So, before we go ahead and get started into this, we probably should consider this guy right here. We're going to go ahead and just revisit him. Now, remember, you got yourself an inside the house party cell goodness. The lights are flashing, you saw that glorious beauty. That took me about 20 minutes. With a bouncer in the middle. And he goes, okay, who wants to come in? And potassium says, okay. Well, sodium says, nah, bro, I'm good. Well, when the door shuts, that completely changes. Potassium wants to go out, sodium wants to go in. It's a nightmare. And the bouncer's like, nah, we aren't doing that. And this really explains why there is different charges on the inside and outside the cell relative to one another. The outside is relatively more positive with inside more of a negative aspect, especially in the neurons. In fact, it is about negative 70 millivolts comparison between that of the inside and outside of a cell. Now that right there, that's an important number. Negative 70 millivolts. That's a resting membrane potential right there in the neuron. Moving on. This is how they determined it. They stuck a clamp inside the cell. It's actually really weird out, amazing how they were able to do it. But yeah, we're not going to talk about it. Pretty much just know that there are more charges on the inside of this, negative charges on the inside of the cell with respect to that of the extracellular fluid. Now, keeping the balance. This guy, right there, he does it very nicely. These are membrane protein channels. There are lots of them. There are multiple different types, all of which can be stimulated to be opened or closed and let in certain things or let out certain things. It just depends upon the channel. Now, here's a few of them right here. The leaky channels, the ones that, if I'm remembering appropriately, we called them the windows of the house. If they're open, you can sneak in through the door. Potassium's going to sneak out, sodium's going to come on in, all that wonderfulness. And then we got the bouncer right there, that sodium potassium ATPase. It requires energy to throw out that sodium against its concentration gradient and pull that potassium back in against its concentration gradient. The bouncer, if you will. Now this bouncer, another type of bouncer can be, bribed or told, hey, open up. Ligand gated is like, if you remember back into acetylcholine goodness, he's like, hey, bro, let my peeps in, okay? He's like, okay. And sodium comes in. Mechanically gated is a little bit different. We haven't really talked about that quite yet. Anything that has some type of mechanical stimulus, such as pressure or, punching, that type of thing, that can cause things to come in as well. You also got other ones, like for instance, your voltage gated channels that you saw in the muscles when we talked about sodium allowing out calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum as well. And that pretty much is what we really care about right here, right now. Because all of these guys have some type of role in a neuron. If it's a sensory neuron that senses mechanical, you're going to bet your bottom dollar that a mechanically gated channel is going to be there. If it is some type of interneuron that requires some type of chemical stimulus, you can bet your bottom dollar again that it is probably a ligand-gated channel. Now, bunch of words. We are actually, if I were to pull apart and tweeze apart these words, action potentials, graded potentials, all these happen within an excitable cell, both of which will occur depending on what stimulus they get or how much ions are released in or out of the cell and what type of neurons. Before we get into that, before we get into how this changes and influxes and changes, let's look at this beautiful graph right here. You got on the x-axis down here at the bottom, time in milliseconds, and yeah, the action potential, these signaling occur in milliseconds. Thankfully, it's in milliseconds. If it weren't, we'd be very, very slow and probably non-existent creatures in the belly of a whale or what have you. And then we got the membrane potential in millivolts. Remember how I said that the negative 70 is the resting membrane potential Hey, important number. Woo, woo, yeah. Okay, so terms that we care about. On this graph, again, this is where the resting membrane potential. Notice that it is 70 millivolts away from zero. It is quite polar compared to it. It is polar. If any type of signal or any change within the cell occurs that makes it go towards this guy, this zero, it becomes depolarizing. Or if it's like that of a mother calling to her infant on the playground, saying, "Hey, honey, it's time to come in," that infant's going to run away from mommy. This zero. It is going to become hyperpolarizing because that infant is hyper and running away from mama because there's just too much fun going on. Going away from zero is hyperpolarizing. Now we can talk about graded versus action potentials. So graded, it's the small itty bitty deviations, whether it be, again, hyperpolarizing or it be depolarizing. Any little influxes, any little changes, the ligand comes along and says, hey, open up so that potassium can come out. Potassium comes out, it's hyperpolarizing. Or chlorine comes in, it's hyperpolarizing. Or you got yourself some sodium. Hey, let in my buddy sodium. Sodium causes a depolarization. All this is a type of graded potential. You won't see any communication, you won't see any message going down this axon in any moment when a graded potential never, ever, ever exceeds negative 55 millivolts. They will always be a graded potential. Now, if it does get to negative 55 millivolts, hey, important number again, that is your action potential threshold there. Now, how perchance do we get to that negative 55 millivolts? There's a couple of ways you can do it. You can be a really, 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 really strong stimulus. Most of the time, that won't really occur. So you kind of have to enlist some buddies. When you enlist some buddies and you get two stimuli, that is called a summation of graded potentials. Summation, where have we heard that word? Sum. First grade, adding together. Yes, that's it. Now I remember. So again, if a graded potential is strong enough and it gets enough buddies together, enough stimuli together, it can actually reach the negative 55 millivolt threshold where an action potential occurs. There is no going back. When the axon hillock, oh, there's that word again. The axon hillock receives that negative 55 millivolt change. Okay. When that occurs, it goes ahead and sends out that message. And this is all of its glorious beauty right here. A depolarizing event that skyrockets up to 30 plus 30 millivolts down, back, and then just comes back to reality and comes back to the resting membrane potential. We're going to go ahead and dive into the basics of how all this occurs and what ion channels play a role. You lucky, lucky souls, you. So there are four phases or four steps. First off, let's look at a resting membrane potential. Resting membrane potentially, you got two. Okay, no, neurons. You got two channels going on here. You got a sodium channel and you got a potassium channel. Remember, potassium's on the inside, sodium's on the outside. Sodium channel has two gates, an activation gate. It opens up when it becomes activated. The inactivation gate closes when it's time to inactivate the gate. I love terminology when it's straightforward. And then you got a potassium gate. It has only one gate within it. There we go. Right there. Notice that this potassium gate is closed and the activation gate is closed, but that inactivation gate is wide open. Now, even though it's open, this gate isn't allowing sodium in because, well, the activation gate is closed. Let's say perhaps we do want to achieve ourselves a little bit of action potential. If enough stimuli comes along and activates it up to negative 55 millivolts at the axon hillock, a action potential occurs, which there is no turning it around. 30 millivolts. It becomes a positive 30 millivolts going through that system. So as soon as that, during this period of time where it is depolarization, that gate is wide open. Both active and inactive gates of the sodium gated channel is open, allowing that very extremely positive, a giant amount of positive sodium ions in, changing its depolarizing and changing its polarity of the resting membrane. Now, step 3, we kind of don't want that to go any further. Remember, we want to have that homeostasis, that balance. If we don't have that homeostasis, that balance, well, the cell is dead. So fortunately, it's not dead. We are going to fix what just happened. So an inactivation gate, the ball and chain that you see, gets stuck or placed in that frame so that sodium can't come in, and to help mitigate that charge, that positive 30 charge, potassium is forced out or released out. It says, woohoo, this party sucks anyways, I'm gone. Goodness. Now, you'll notice that I put this word right here, absolute refractory. Absolute refractory reply means that no matter what you do, no matter how hard you try, you cannot re-stimulate an action potential. You cannot make a neuron during this period return back to positive 30 millivolts. There's absolutely no way. Also, a quick reminder that your sodium potassium pump is always going. It is trying to pump sodium out and potassium back in, helping restabilize that sodium potassium balance. Now, this final step, once you reach negative 55 millivolts, you'll notice that the inactivation gate has become open, but the activation gate is closed. That means, hey, we have an opportunity here, if we really, really want it, to reopen up and cause an activation event again. Here's the problem though, you're fighting against something here. They are still letting out potassium, a very positive ion, which means that if you really, really want to do an action potential, you're going to have to fight against that loss of potassium, or just be patient and let the potassium gate finally close when it reaches that hyperpolarization point and closes up again. So, again, one last thing just to point out, I did mention that absolute refractory period here, that no matter what you do, you cannot force it to keep on being at that action potential. But by golly, you can go ahead and make it re-go over and over and over again if you have the strong super threshold stimulus going on. This is how your muscles, or signaling your muscles, hey, stay there, be happy, goes on. You get boom, 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 kind of like one of those little starters on a stove or in a barbecue or what have you. So here it is in all of its wonderfulness, all 4 steps, if you so wish and desire to see it all together. Step 1, resting membrane potential, some type of stimulus says, hey, let's do something. Sodium gate opens, allowing sodium in. You reach 30 millivolts, and it says, nah, we're good now. We need to restabilize. Inactivation closes. Inactivation gate closes, disallowing sodium in. Potassium gate opens to let potassium go, yes, I'm free. That repolarization phase continues to occur until it finally hits about negative 55 millivolts, where the activation gate is closed and the inactivation gate becomes open, ending the absolute refractory period, but you definitely still have to fight in order to reopen. After that hyperpolarization event occurs, the potassium gate finally closes, everything's reset and ready to go again. Now here's a chart of all the differences between a graded potential and action potential. Let's just go ahead and summarize it ourselves. Graded potentials are just anything that occurs in the dendrites, the body, or the axon hillock that never make it to negative 55 millivolts. Action potentials happen in the trigger zone or the axon hillock, if you're remembering appropriately. If it makes it to the negative 55 millivolts there, oh yeah, we're sending a message and you aren't stopping us. Gray potentials, you got the ligand or mechanical, but this one is the voltage / sodium potassium. Amplitude depends upon the stimulus. But action potential, if you don't make it to negative 55 millivolts, it's going to happen or it's not going to happen. Duration, it could last a while for graded, while action potentials, it's very quick, like milliseconds, 1 or 2 milliseconds quick. This one, again, polarity on graded potentials, it can be running away from mama or coming closer to mama. This one is, yeah, you're going to repolarize or depolarize followed by repolarization. Refractory, hey, you can do whatever you want on a bunches of votes for a graded potential, but an action potential, there is a refractory period. It can only happen once, has to reset before it can do its thing again. So in order for communications to occur, you have to have the action potentials. Graded potentials aren't going to work. And those action potentials, like, wow, this is like super important. I can't believe I keep on saying it. Axon hillocks is where it happens. If this is triggered, a signal sent down to the axon terminals, the place where the cell is going to interact or send messages to other neurons to say, hey, open up. Let's create a graded potential, or it'll say, hey, don't open up. We don't want you opening up, and an inhibitory signal sent. Depends on the signal that's being sent out at the end of those axon terminals. We'll be talking about that in a little while. But we do need to talk about how signals occur and how quickly they can occur. If we go back to your oligodendrocytes and satellite cells and Schwann cells, you'll remember that we have a wonderful little insulation. On the left side, that you'll notice that we are lacking those myelinated sheaths, but over here you do have the myelinated sheaths. You'll notice on the y-axis 1 millisecond, 5 millisecond, 10 millisecond. This one hasn't made it very far on the 10 millisecond. Well, this one, holy cow, that's amazing. Isn't that great, wonderful? Look how fast it's gone. It looks like me driving down the causeway. Now, this one is called continuous, meaning that it's just a continual thing. Well, this one's a saltatory conduction. Those of you that are deprived of the Latin or Spanish-based language, let me go ahead and show you a wonderful little thing. Dora's here to help us. Yay, Dora! Salta, salta, you stinking taskbar. Look, it says salta, salta there. Salta literally means jump or skip in both Latin or Spanish. Go ahead, do it. Salta, salta. You know you want to. Let your little inner child come out. Salta, salta. Jump. Anyways, that is what it's referring to. You are skipping along that neuron. The way that insulation occurs, it makes certain that that sodium or that potassium doesn't have to leave or enter the cell. Because of this barrier, it allows it go ahead and drift down there without any impedance, without any loss of signal, without a fight. That goodness and wonderfulness. Other factors that will affect propagation: axon diameter. The wider the wire, the more it can conduct. Same is true with axons. The wider the wire, the quicker the conduction. Amount of myelination, hey, if it's well myelinated, if it has that insulation, you're doing great. Temperature, just like your electronics, if If it's too hot, it ain't gonna work very well. If it's too cold, it takes a little while to warm up. Amazing how electricity works, huh? Now, here's a really quick thing some of the people have been asking me about multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis affects your myelination. Your immune system says, you know what? This stuff is dumb. I don't understand science. I don't understand technology. Okay, no, it doesn't have. It's not. I'm anthropomorphizing or teleologically speaking. Who cares? These myelinated sheaths gotta go. So it starts damaging it. It starts destroying it. And what do we know about continuous versus saltatory conduction? The continuous is much slower. Now, some might say, you know what? That's not a big deal. It kind of is. Okay, it is a lot. So multiple sclerosis, again, you got to have that insulation for many, many neurons. You're going to have some big issues. So what would happen if you stripped away those wires? What do you think the signs and symptoms would be? Well, you could be uncoordinated. One side could not be working very well. The left is a little bit slower than the right, or vice versa. You'd have one-sided blindness, both-sided blindness. You could have double vision. You could have split vision. You could have a whole bunch of things. Fatigue. You could also have pain. It's not a pretty disease. Um, that could relapse, meaning that you can bounce back. But if it's progressed to a point, then there is no bouncing back, unfortunately. So with that, that is our discussion on action potentials. Go ahead, take a break. We're going to be talking about how once the action potential actually makes it to the axon terminal, what goes on there, what's released, what's basically how does a neuron communicate with another neuron.